This video is on instructional strategies that work, and it focuses on the instructional strategy of identifying similarities and differences. In order for students to understand how to identify similarities and differences, they need to start with guided instruction. This is when the teachers guide the students in identifying similarities and differences and help them. By doing this, the students' understanding of and ability to use knowledge enhances. An example right here shows the teacher showing a Venn diagram. In this situation, my students were comparing a regular map of the world to an upside down map of the world. In this instruction, it shows the teacher guiding the instruction. It's up on the board for all the students to see, and it leads them through it so that they have an understanding of how it's completed, and through this it enhances their ability to use knowledge. The next type of instruction that's helpful for students to learn this task is independent practice. By students independently practicing learning similarities and differences, it also helps their understanding of and ability to use knowledge in the classroom. Here's an example of some students working independently. At this point, they are using the Venn diagram as the teacher had presented the previous day to make comparisons and contrasts to two different items. Using graphics to identify similarities and differences, it also helps the students' understanding of and ability to use knowledge. An example would be a Venn diagram. That's when two different items are compared and contrasted. In this item, we find the differences between the two items. In the center, you have the similarities between the two. Another form would be a comparison matrix. This is when the characteristics of what they're looking for are labeled, hair color, and then what they're going to be comparing and the different items. In a graphic web, it's when things are classified. You might have things that are similar on one side and things that are different on another side, but it's using a web form. There's 4 ways to teach to identify similarities and differences. They're comparing, classifying, creating metaphors, and creating analogies. In order to compare, the key of learning how to do this is to compare 2 or more items and be able to identify the important characteristics of these 2 items. It starts with the teacher-directed comparison, as in the guided practice, is when the teacher identifies what students need to compare and what characteristics they're looking for to compare. The student-directed comparison task is when a student have the choice. They can either identify what needs to be compared, or they can identify what characteristics they're looking for. And the teacher may provide, okay, you're going to compare apples to oranges, and then the students must find what things they're going to compare, about what characteristics. Classifying is when students organize elements into groups based on their similarities. Teacher-directed would be that the teacher gives students an item and tells them what categories they need to make them. An example would be if a teacher gave students some shapes, cut out shapes, and there were different sizes and colors, and the teacher said, okay, you're going to sort them by color, or the teacher said you're going to sort them by the size. A student-directed classification task would be the teacher still can give the items that they sort. She still could give them shapes, but there's different colors, sizes, and shapes, and the students must identify how they're going to sort them. Are they going to sort them by the color, by the shape, by the size? Metaphors. Students must understand that 2 items in a metaphor are related abstractly. This is challenging for students because they have to think in that abstract form, and a lot of students have trouble doing this. Teacher-directed metaphor task is when a teacher provides students with the beginning of the metaphor and the abstract relationship, and then the students build on that. So the teacher is providing the metaphor and then is explaining how it is related and how it is abstract. The student-directed metaphor is when the students are given part of a metaphor and they either have to complete it or they have to decide how they describe the abstract relationship that is found in that metaphor. Analogies are when students must understand how 2 things that are not necessarily alike and related can be similar. Teacher-directed analogy is when the teacher guides the students. Maybe the teacher gives the students the actual analogy, and the students must decide how is it related, how are these items related. For example, a teacher might tell the students, a foot is to a shoe as a hand is to a glove. And the students are to determine, well, how are these 2 items related, even though they're different? Student-directed analogy tasks are when students are given a lot more independence. They might be asked to complete an analogy, it's given the first form and left out a word and they have to fill it in. It could be that they create their own analogy based on a topic a teacher gives. Or they might be asked to completely explain the relationship found in a certain analogy or analogy they create.